Who taught you that song? In 20 years, nobody who'd worked for Christian Vital had ever heard him raise his voice. That night, 70 people heard it at once. The night shift log at the Vital building on Wacker Drive listed her the way it listed the freight schedule and the trash pickup. Keene, A, 10 at night to 6 in the morning. Floors 38 through 44. Nothing else, and nobody asked for anything else. Audrey Keene was 27. She pushed a cleaning cart 6 nights a week, and in all the months she'd worked that tower, not one person had ever heard her say a single word. So they settled on the explanation that didn't cost them anything. She couldn't. 44 floors up, the lights in Christian Vital's office burned past midnight most nights. 37 years old, rich enough to buy a city block, and cold enough to do it before breakfast. The kind of man other men lowered their voices around without ever deciding to. On the night of his birthday, 70 guests filled a mansion up on the North Shore, and the company staffing the event came up short, so Audrey was sent out to work the floor. Christian stepped out back for a cigarette, because being toasted by strangers had started to feel like work. He was gone 8 minutes. When he came back to the doorway, his fiancée had the cleaning woman down on her knees in front of the whole room, picking up broken glass by hand, and she was smiling when she said it. "They tell me you're mute, so sing for me, and I'll let you go." The room laughed. They were all waiting on the same thing, a woman opening her mouth and nothing coming out of it. Audrey stood up, and she sang. His cigarette hit the floor before the second line was out of her, because it wasn't a song any of them knew, in a language most of them couldn't place. He crossed that room in front of 70 people, took hold of her wrist, and asked her the only question that had ever mattered to him. Audrey looked at him, and she said nothing at all. If this story's already got hold of you, go ahead and hit that like button. Share it with somebody who'd understand what it costs to stay quiet, and subscribe so the next one finds you too. Now let's go back to that room, and to the question nobody in it was ready to hear the answer to. The silence held longer than a room that size should have been able to hold anything at all. Christian still had her wrist in his hand. He hadn't decided to keep it, and he hadn't decided to let it go. And in the space where that decision should have been, there was only the strange fact of how still she was. Her arm sat slack in his grip, no pull in it, no flinch. That was what made him look down. There was blood on her palm, 3 thin lines where the glass had opened her up, and a wider smear across the inside of her fingers, where she'd closed her hand around the pieces and gone on closing it. She'd been holding them the whole while. She was holding them yet, gathered in her fist like something she meant to keep. He let go the way a man sets down an object he's only just understood was never his to pick up. She didn't rub the wrist. She didn't step back from him. She stood there in front of 70 people with broken glass shut inside her hand and looked at him, and he understood, with a clarity that came at him sideways, that whatever he said next, she wasn't going to be the one who filled the room back up. Behind him, the room had stopped pretending. 70 guests who had spent the whole evening deciding not to see the people carrying their plates were now looking at nothing else in the world. Vivian Ashford moved first, because Vivian always moved first. "Well," she said, bright, her voice pitched carefully for the back wall. "That's one way to earn a tip." She'd delivered 100 lines like it, in 100 rooms just like this one, and every one of them had landed, and men had laughed and women had turned their faces away smiling. Not one person laughed. What came back at her was worse than being booed. It was a silence that stretched, and kept stretching, and belonged entirely to her now, and she had to go on standing inside it, while every guest in the room did the arithmetic and arrived at the same sum, which was that they had just watched a woman put another woman on her knees for their entertainment, and had waited to see how it turned out. Her face didn't change. Her hand did, once, closing at her side. Over by the fireplace, Salvatore Vitali set his glass down on the mantel, and his hand wasn't entirely steady when he did it. Christian turned toward Marcus Doyle and spoke without raising his voice again. "We're finished. Get them out." Marcus had worked for him 9 years, and never once needed a second sentence. He went out through the front hall and the machinery started, and there was something almost obscene in how quickly it all came apart. Coats appearing. Cars called forward. Drivers waking in the turnaround with their headlights sweeping the hedges. 140 shoes moving across gravel in the dark. Nobody said goodnight. Nobody wished him a happy birthday on the way out, and much later, when he had the leisure to think about that evening in order, it struck him as the only honest thing that had happened in it. They weren't leaving because a party had ended. Every man in that hall had lived in this city long enough to know the difference between an evening going wrong and Christian Vitale beginning to work a thing out. And there were stories about the years when he had, none of which any of them could have told you where they'd heard, and all of which they believed. One man from a construction local tried for a handshake at the door and held his arm out 3 full seconds before he understood that it wasn't going to be taken. And then he put it down and went out with the others. 20 minutes, 70 people. A house that had been loud enough to hear from the county road came down to the sound of one caterer stacking trays in a kitchen. Vivian caught him in the hallway before he reached the stairs. "Do you have any idea what you just did?" He didn't answer her. "Half the men who walked out of here do business with my father. You put your hand on a cleaning woman in front of them. You put her on her knees in front of them first. It came out level. There was no heat in it anywhere. And that was the part that frightened her, because heat can be argued with and answered and outlasted. That's a different thing entirely." "It isn't." "Christian, listen to me. Go home, Vivienne." She stayed exactly where she was long enough to make her leaving a decision instead of an obedience. And then she went, and the front door closed behind her with considerably less noise than she'd have chosen. He walked back into the main room expecting to find it empty. Audrey Keene was on her knees again. Nobody had told her to be. She'd found a dustpan somewhere and a folded cloth, and she'd wound the cloth around her right hand and pulled the knot tight with her teeth, and she was working the last of the glass out from beneath the edge of the sideboard, where the smallest pieces had traveled, and where no person standing upright would ever have seen them. She was finishing the work. The party was dead. The house was emptying. The woman who had humiliated her in front of 140 eyes was gone down the driveway, and she was on the floor of a house that had nothing to do with her, making certain there wasn't a shard left in the carpet for somebody's dog, or somebody's grandchild, or somebody's bare foot in the morning. Christian stood in the doorway and watched her do it, and something in his chest turned over in a direction he had no name ready for. She got the last piece. She stood. She carried the dustpan out toward the kitchen with the cloth on her hand going slowly dark, and she passed within 4 feet of him without once looking up, and he let her go by. Walter Hale was standing at the foot of the stairs. He'd been there some while, one hand resting on the newel post, and he followed her the whole way across the room and past him and out through the far door, and he watched her a beat longer than a man watches someone he has never met in his life. Then he turned and went up. Christian came back to the middle of the room. The chairs were all pushed wrong. There was a wet ring on the floor where a glass had gone over, and a dark spot on the pale carpet where she'd knelt twice, and that was the whole sum of 37 years. Marcus came in and stopped at the distance it had taken him 9 years to calibrate. "The van's still out front for the event staff," he said. "You want me to put her on it?" "No. Then what do you want me to do?" Christian looked at the mark on the carpet for a long moment. "I want to know who she is," he said. "By morning." She didn't leave that night, and she wasn't asked whether she wanted to. It was Marcus who put it to her, standing in the kitchen doorway with the van idling out front and its taillights red on the wet gravel. Mr. Vitale would prefer that she stay until morning. There was a room at the back of the house on the ground floor, and the housekeeper's bath was next to it, and the door had a lock on the inside. He said the part about the lock deliberately, and he watched her hear it. She looked at the van. She looked at the clock over the stove, which read 1:15, and she'd have been on a bus at 2 and at her own door by 3 and back on the Wacker Drive shift Monday at 10. Then she untied the cloth from her hand and rinsed it in the sink and hung it over the faucet to dry. And she picked up her coat, and she went where he pointed her. She didn't say thank you, and she didn't say anything else. And Marcus stood in the hall a moment after her door closed, trying to decide whether he'd just done something decent or whether he'd just locked a woman in a room and given her the key so she'd feel better about it. He couldn't get the arithmetic to come out clean either way. Christian didn't sleep. He sat in the study with the lamp on and the account books he hadn't opened and the whole quiet weight of the house pressing down on him from above, and every few minutes his mind went back to a hand closing on broken glass and holding it. At 6:30, Marcus knocked and came in with a folder, and it was thinner than a folder about a stranger has any right to be. He set it on the desk and stayed standing. "Audrey Elizabeth Keene," he said. 27 years old. Born at St. Bernard's on the south side. No record. Not so much as a parking citation. Christian turned the first page. 2 jobs, Marcus said. 6 until 9:30 in the evening. She cleans a law office in the South Loop. And 10 until 6, she's in your building. 6 nights a week. Rents a room on 46th Street in back of the yards, month to month, and she's late on it. Has been late on it for a while. Family. Mother died 3 years ago in April. Eileen Keene. Registered nurse. 29 years. No father listed. No siblings. No cousins that turn up anywhere. There's no one. Christian turned another page. It was a hospital billing statement, and it had been photographed rather than printed, which meant it had come out of a mailbox or a drawer or a shoebox, and he chose not to ask which. $11,000 in change, and beneath it, a payment history, going down the column in $100 increments, month after month after month, 30-some entries of it, never late, never skipped, never more and never less. $100 at a time against 11,000. He sat and looked at that column for longer than he looked at anything else in the folder. The debt's not hers legally, Marcus said. Estate went insolvent. She could have walked away from it 3 years ago and nobody in the world would have come after her. But she's paying it. Every month. Christian closed the folder. What's the part you're not saying? Marcus took a moment. There's nothing in there, he said. That's the part. I've done this work for you 9 years and I've never handed you a file this clean. No boyfriend, no lawyer, no union grievance, doesn't drink, doesn't gamble, no bank account beyond a check casher on Ashland. She's not in anybody's phone. She hasn't got a phone. Whoever she is, she has spent 3 years making herself into a woman nobody would ever have reason to look at twice. He paused. Nobody's that invisible by accident. Christian understood then that he'd been hoping for something in the folder, some name or connection or debt owed sideways to a man he could go and speak with, some ordinary explanation that would let him put the whole night down and go back to being who he'd been at 8 o'clock the previous evening. The folder gave him nothing, and the nothing was worse, because it meant the only place the answer lived was in the woman down the hall, who had chosen not to speak for reasons he couldn't purchase or subpoena or threaten out of her. He sent for her at 9. She came into the study with her coat over her arm as though she expected to be dismissed from the premises, and she stood in front of the desk instead of sitting in the chair he'd left pulled out, and he noticed that she'd bandaged her own hand properly overnight out of something she'd found in the housekeeper's bath. He didn't offer her a doctor. He'd learned by then that offering her things made her stand straighter. "There's no one alive who knows that song," he said. "My mother made it up. She never wrote it down, and she never sang it where anybody could hear it but me." He waited. Outside, a landscaping crew was working somewhere past the hedges and the sound came in thin and ordinary. "I'm going to ask you once more," he said. "And I'm not going to ask you anything about yourself. And I'm not going to hold anything over you. Who taught it to you?" Audrey looked at the corner of the desk. She looked at it the way a person looks at a door they've locked from the inside and don't intend to open, and her face was neither frightened nor defiant, and she let the silence run out to its natural end and past it. And she gave him nothing at all. He didn't ask a third time. She came out of the study and walked straight down the back hall toward the kitchen, and she was still carrying her coat over her arm, and she'd got as far as the door when Walter Hale said, "Miss Keene." She stopped. In 8 months at the tower on Wacker Drive, nobody had used her name aloud. It went on badge lists and shift logs and the line above a signature, and men said, "Hey," and women said, "Excuse me," and the security desk said, "Evening," and none of it had ever been her name. She turned around. Walter was at the kitchen table with 2 cups set out in front of him and the pot between them, and he was 71 years old and had been in that house for 40 years, and he had the bearing of a man who had spent all 40 of them knowing precisely how much space he was permitted to occupy and never once taking an inch more. "Sit down," he said. "You've been standing since 1 o'clock this morning." She looked at the 2 cups. There was no reasonable way to read them except the way they were meant, so she put her coat over the back of a chair and sat, and Walter set the tea in front of her and pushed the sugar bowl an inch toward her hand, and then took his own chair on the other side of the table, which was the correct distance. And he didn't touch his own cup for a while. "I've worked for this family since I was 31 years old," he said. "I don't tell people things. I want that understood before I say the rest." He turned his cup a quarter turn on the saucer. "His father died when he was 12, Vincent. That was in the fall. And I remember the boy came down to breakfast the next morning at the ordinary hour, dressed, hair wet, and he ate what was put in front of him and he went to school. 12 years old. Nobody had to make him do any part of it." Audrey held the cup and didn't drink. 2 years after that, his mother went, Walter said. 14. And there's a thing that happens to a certain kind of boy when the second one goes, and I've had a long while to think about what it is. He came to the conclusion that grief is a form of idleness, that if he was busy enough, and useful enough, and hard enough, then one day he would get up in the morning and simply not feel it, and that the feeling was the part of him that had failed, not the world. He set the cup down. He's 37 years old and he still believes it. 23 years he's been testing that theory. He has more money than the men who own the banks that own the buildings. And he works past midnight most nights. And last evening he stood in the middle of his own birthday, and there wasn't one person in that room he could have said a true sentence to. Audrey looked at the tabletop. "I'm not telling you this to make you feel sorry for him," Walter said. "A man who does what he does hasn't got a claim on anybody's pity, and I'd be a fool to ask you for it on his behalf. I'm telling you because I've watched him for 23 years, and something moved in him last night. And whether that turns out to be a mercy or a calamity, I don't know yet, and neither does he." He was quiet a moment, "But you'd best know that you're standing in the middle of it." She reached across for the paper sack from the bakery delivery that was folded on the table, and she took the pencil out of the jar by the window, and she wrote along the white margin of it, in a small upright hand, and turned it toward him. "I didn't come here for him." Walter read it. He read it twice, and something at the corner of his mouth eased, and it wasn't quite amusement, and it wasn't quite sorrow. "No," he said. "People almost never come for anybody. They just come." He poured himself more tea he didn't want. 40 years in this house, and I've watched a good many people arrive with reasons they were certain of. The reasons hardly ever turn out to be the thing that keeps them. "That's not a warning, Miss Keene. It's only the truth about houses," she wrote again, lower down on the sack. "I'll be back at the building Monday, 10 o'clock. "I expect you will," Walter said. Then he did a thing he hadn't planned to do. The badge on its lanyard was lying on the table where she'd set it down along with her coat, and he drew it toward himself with 2 fingers to move it out of the way of the pot, and he read it. Keene, A. The photograph, the number, the plain black letters. He read the name for a good deal longer than a man needs in order to move a lanyard 6 inches across a table, and his thumb stayed on the edge of the plastic, and his face didn't alter in any way that she could have described afterward. Then he pushed it back to her and turned toward the window and looked out at nothing in the yard. "There's a car at 11, he said, and his voice had gone flat and useful again. "Marcus will take you. Eat something before you go. There's no earthly sense in getting on a bus hungry." He rinsed his cup at the sink with his back to the room, and he set it in the rack, and he went out through the far door without saying goodbye to her, which she understood by then was simply how the men in that house managed the things they couldn't put into sentences. She was back on the floor Monday at 10 o'clock, and none of what had happened in the house on the North Shore had any bearing on the tower on Wacker Drive, and that was the whole reason she went back. 8 months she'd been doing those 7 floors, and the work had a shape to it by then, and the shape was the closest thing to peace she owned. 38 through 43 were empty by 10, 44 was not. The lights in the corner office burned most nights, and the man behind the desk never looked up, and she had learned him the way you learn weather. She knew he took his coffee black and let it go cold. She knew that when the phone rang after midnight, he answered it in 3 words or fewer, and that when he set it down, the room got colder by some measure that had nothing to do with the thermostat. She knew that he never once, in 8 months, said a word to her, and she had come to understand that this was not contempt. It was the only courtesy he had in stock. There was a photograph on the 3rd shelf of the bookcase behind his chair, a small silver frame, and in it, a dark-haired woman was laughing at whoever was holding the camera, and she was not dressed for anything, and the laugh was not for the picture. The frame sat crooked. It sat crooked because the shelf had a lip, and the felt on the frame's foot had worn through on one side, and every night when Audrey dusted that shelf, she turned it square again, and every few nights it would have gone crooked again, and she would square it again. She didn't know the woman's name. She never asked anyone. She did it the way she did everything on those floors, which was thoroughly and without any expectation of being seen doing it, and in 8 months, she never once looked at the photograph for longer than the work required. Then sometime in the 2nd month, a cup of coffee began appearing on the low table by the window. It was a 2nd cup, poured from the same pot, set down where a person coming in with a cart would pass it, and it was never mentioned, and there was never a note. The first night she left it alone, and it was still there in the morning, cold, untouched. The 2nd night it was there again. On the third night, she drank it standing at the window, with the city laid out below her in its grid of small lights. 44 floors up, at 2 in the morning. And she washed the cup and set it back on the tray, and she went on with the 7th floor of the evening. After that, it was there most nights. Neither of them ever said one word about it. In the 8th month, she opened her pay envelope on a Friday and found 16 hours gone out of it. She checked the log at the service desk, and the log had her signature down for every one of the 16, so she went to the supervisor's office in the basement, and the man behind the desk there told her the system had been adjusted and that he was the one who did the adjusting. And then he came around the desk and stood a good deal closer to her than the conversation required and told her he could put those hours back and put a few more on top if she was somebody who understood how a favor worked. He was close enough that she could see the shine on his forehead. She took one step back, and then another. And her face didn't change at all. She had learned in 3 years how to keep a face still, and she kept it still. And she left the office without a sound and went up to 38 and started her floors. That was Friday. On Monday, there was a different man in the basement office. Nobody announced it. Nobody explained it. The man from the basement office didn't turn up at another building. He didn't turn up at any building. Within a month, there wasn't a janitorial contractor in 3 counties around Chicago who would take his application. And nobody ever told him why. And nobody had to, because nothing had been put in writing, and nothing ever would be. The following Friday, her envelope had the 16 hours in it, and it also had the correct total. And there was no note. And there was no adjustment. And nobody at any level of that building ever said his name in front of her again. She looked at the envelope for a while in the freight elevator. She could have gone up to 44 and stood in the doorway and said thank you, and there'd have been a kind of accounting in it, a debt named and acknowledged, and therefore owed. She thought about that for the length of 30 floors. Then she folded the envelope into her coat pocket and pushed her card out onto 38. And she never asked, and he never told her, and the thing simply sat there between them, unnamed, like a stone in a field that 2 people plow around for years, without either of them ever suggesting it be moved. That was the arrangement, and she'd have kept it for years. She squared the crooked frame. He left the second cup. Neither of them ever crossed the 4 feet of carpet that separated one of those acts from the other. And 8 months went by in which not a single word passed between them, and she went home on the bus at 6 in the morning with the sun coming up over the rail yards, and she thought of that building as the only place in the city of Chicago where nobody wanted anything from her at all. 9 nights went by after that Friday, and the arrangement held, and then on the 10th night it didn't. She came onto 44 a little after midnight, and the desk lamp was on, and the overheads were off, and he was in the chair with his back to the windows and the city behind him, and there was no work in front of him, no folder, no phone in his hand. That was the thing she noticed. Because in 8 months, she had never once seen that desk without paper on it. She got her cloth out and started at the far wall the way she always did, and she was most of the way along the bookcase when he began to speak, and he wasn't speaking to her. He was looking at the middle of the room, at the place where the lamplight stopped, and he spoke the way a man speaks in a car by himself. "My mother's people came out of a town in the hills above Palermo," he said. "Her grandmother never learned English. 60 years in this country and she died without it. So the language my mother sang in wasn't Italian, whatever anybody in that room thought they were hearing. It was the old dialect off that hillside, and there aren't 1,000 people left alive who speak it, and there weren't 1,000 then." Audrey's hand kept moving on the shelf. It was the only reason she was able to stay in the room. "She made the song up herself," he said. "She used to say her grandmother gave her the tune, and she gave it the words. And I never knew whether that was true, or whether she was being modest about the whole of it. She sang it to me every night of my life until I was 14. There is no recording of it. Nobody in this family owned a tape machine, and there'd have been no reason to point one at a woman putting her son to bed. She never wrote it down. She wasn't a woman who wrote things down. She thought writing a thing down was how you gave yourself permission to forget it." He shifted his weight in the chair, and the leather made the small sound it made. "She died in June. I was 14 years old. And from the day she died until 3 weeks ago, in 23 years, there have been 2 people on this earth who knew that song existed." He stopped. Then he said it again, differently, the way a man tests a joint he suspects is broken. 2 people. Her and me. And she's been gone 23 years. The silence that came after that went on a long while. Somewhere below them a train went along the river, and the sound came up faint through 60 feet of glass and steel. Audrey stood with her cloth in her hand and the crooked frame 6 inches from her fingers, and she looked at the woman laughing in the photograph, and she understood at last whose face she'd been squaring on that shelf for 8 months. She understood a good deal else in the same instant, and none of it was anything she could carry out of that room and set down. There was a pressure behind her sternum that she had not felt in 3 years, and had assumed she was done with. She could have finished the shelf. She had finished 1,000 things in her life that hurt worse than that shelf. She stood there, and she felt the whole weight of 3 years lean against a door, and she was aware of her own breathing, and she was aware of the man in the chair sitting with a thing he had said out loud for the first time in 23 years to a woman he believed could not answer him. And that was the part she couldn't do. Not the song, not the mother, not the 23 years, not the pity, which she had no interest in and which he would have thrown back at her anyway. It was the arithmetic. He had sat in that chair and counted, and he had come out 1 short, and he had said the wrong number into an empty room and believed it. She opened her mouth. Her voice, when it came out of a place 3 years disused, and it had rust all through it, and it did not sound to her like anything she recognized as her own. 3 people. Christian came out of the chair. He was on his feet without any memory of the intervening motion, and his hand had gone flat on the desk to take his weight, and the lamp swung a shadow up the wall behind him. She was already moving. She hadn't run. She'd set the cloth on the top of the cart and pushed it out the office door and down the corridor with the wheels ticking over the seam in the floor, and by the time he got around the desk and to the doorway, the corridor was empty, except for the cart standing outside 4412, and the door to the service stairwell was easing shut on its closer with the last inch of its travel. He stood in the doorway with his hand on the frame. He did not go after her. He stood there in the dark of that corridor for a long time, and 30 years of arithmetic came apart in his hands, and the only thing in the world he was certain of anymore was that somewhere in this city there was a 4th person, or there had been one, and that woman on his floors had gotten it from somebody, and that somebody had been in a room with his mother. 3 weeks after the party, Vivian Ashford sat across a lunch table from a woman she had known since boarding school and watched that woman decide not to mention it. That was how she learned the size of what had happened to her. Nobody mentioned it. Not the woman at lunch, not the 2 who came for coffee on Thursday, not her own mother, and the not mentioning was so careful and so complete that it amounted to a kind of monument. Twice she caught the edge of it going quiet as she came into a room. Once, at a benefit on Michigan Avenue, a man she'd known for years said good evening to her and then looked at her hands, and she understood that he was looking to see whether she was the sort of person who would do that again. People had always been a little afraid of her, and she had built a life out of the usefulness of that. Now they were something else. They pitied her. It sat in her like swallowed glass, and the thing she came back to, over and over, at 2 a.m, with the ceiling above her, was not that Christian had taken hold of another woman's wrist in front of 70 people. She had considered that from every angle, and it did not touch her where the injury was. What kept her awake was the silence. Her line had been good. In any other room on any other night, that line would have gotten a laugh, and instead a woman who cleaned floors for a living had stood there with her hands shut around broken glass and said absolutely nothing, and 70 people had chosen the silence over her. A cleaning woman had made her small. In front of everyone she had spent 11 years assembling, and the worst of it, the part she could not get out from under, was that the cleaning woman hadn't done a single thing to bring it about. She hadn't argued, or wept, or appealed to anybody. She had simply stood there and let herself be looked at, and the room had turned. So on a Tuesday in the middle of May, Vivian drove out to Elmwood Park and sat in the front room of a house that was smaller and plainer than anything her own family owned, and Salvatore Vitali poured her a cup of coffee she didn't want, and sat down in the chair across from her with the unhurried patience of a man who had known she'd come, and had simply been waiting to see how many weeks it would take. "You've heard," she said. "I was standing 11 feet away, Vivian. Then you've heard the rest of it, whatever's being said. I hear most things." He stirred his coffee once and set the spoon down on the saucer. "Ask me what you drove all the way out here to ask." She took a moment to arrange it, and when it came out, she was surprised at how plainly she was willing to say it. "Is the wedding happening?" "September," Sal said. "The 11th. The church is booked, and your father's people have had the date for 4 months." "That isn't what I asked." "No." He looked at her, and there was nothing unkind in his face. and that was somehow worse than if there had been. You want to know whether my nephew intends to marry you? Yes. My nephew, Sal said, intends whatever is required. He has never in his life done otherwise. And I would know, because I raised him from 14, and I have never once had to explain a requirement to him twice. He picked the cup up. The arrangement between this family and your father's isn't a courtship, and you've known that since the first dinner. Your name opens rooms that our money can't. Our end of it your father can count on a page. Both sides did their arithmetic 3 years ago, and neither side has revised it. And a cleaning woman doesn't change the arithmetic. A cleaning woman, Sal said, changes nothing at all. He said it with such flat finality that for a moment she nearly believed the whole afternoon had been unnecessary. Then he set the cup down. But you didn't drive out here about arithmetic, he said. You drove out here because you were humiliated in a room full of people who'll remember it for 20 years. And you want to know whether anything is going to be done about it. That's a different question, and it's a fair one, and I don't hold it against you. She didn't answer, which was an answer. Sal leaned back. Outside, somebody was running a mower 2 houses down, and the sound came in through the screen, thin and domestic, and entirely ordinary. Let me tell you the one thing I know that's worth anything, he said. Everybody thinks power is money, or men, or what you can put your hands on. It isn't. Power is knowing a person's name, and knowing where it's been. You'd be astonished what a name can be made to do, if a man is willing to be patient with it. He let that sit exactly as long as it needed to. Then he stood, and the visit was over, and he walked her to the door with his hand not quite touching her elbow. Go home, Vivian, he said. Buy something. Be seen buying it. And don't come out here again. Because there are men who watch this house, and there's no sense in either of us explaining you to anybody. She was on the expressway before she understood that he had never once told her what he meant to do. He didn't send Marcus after her, and he didn't have her transferred off the floor. And for 4 nights, she came on to 44 at the ordinary hour, and neither of them spoke, and the second cup was on the low table, where it had always been. On the third of those nights, she came in at midnight while he was on the telephone, and she went on with the shelf, and she heard the whole of it, because it took less than a minute. A subcontractor on the 95th Street job was 4 months behind on something, and had explained why at some length. Christian let him finish. Then he said the job was closed to him, and that he understood the man also held paper on 2 schools out in DuPage County, and a parking structure in Oak Brook, and that he expected those would be reconsidered by the end of the week. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten anybody. He never once said the name of another living person. And he never said what would happen or who would do it. Because in a business of that kind, the sentence a man doesn't say is the one that does the work. He said goodnight, put the telephone down, and made a note in the margin of a page. Audrey squared the frame on the 3rd shelf and said nothing. She had known since her first month whose building she was cleaning. Everybody on that crew knew. She wrung out her cloth and went on to the credenza, and the only thought she had about it was that a man in that chair had put a second cup of coffee on a table for 4 months, without ever once mentioning it, and that both of those things were true about the same person, and that she had stopped a long while ago expecting people to be only one thing. On the 5th night, he was standing at the window when she came in, and he turned around and looked at her hand. The bandage she'd put on it herself 11 days before had been changed, and changed again out of a drugstore box, and the last one had gone stiff and gray at the edges from ammonia and hot water, and 8 nights of wringing out cloths, and the 2 deeper lines under it had opened again and hadn't closed. He crossed the room and picked up the telephone and said 4 words into it, and then he went out and came back some minutes later with a white metal box that the building kept on every floor and had never once been opened on any of them. He set it on the low table beside the coffee. He didn't ask her. He simply sat down on the edge of the table and waited. And after a while, she came over and sat in the chair, and she put her right hand out palm up on her own knee. He took the old bandage off. It came away badly at one edge, and he stopped and worked it loose with his thumbnail rather than pull it. And neither of them said a word about that. He cleaned the cuts with what was in the box, and there was a moment when it went into the deeper of the 2, and her hand tightened once, all on its own, and he waited without moving until it eased. They were the hands of a man who had done a great deal of hard work at 17 and 18, and had never lost the shape of it. And there was nothing tender in the way he worked, only exact. He got the gauze wound and cut the tape with a pair of scissors from the box, and pressed the last edge down flat with 2 fingers. Then he let go. Neither of them stood up. She sat with her hand in her lap, and he sat on the edge of the table 3 feet away, and the coffee went cold beside them, and the city went on being lit up beneath the windows, and 11 or 12 minutes passed in which nothing whatsoever happened. When she finally got up and went back to her cart, the thing that had occurred between them had no name, and neither of them gave it one, then or afterward. 2 nights later, he found the door on the glassed-in room at the end of 44 standing properly closed. It was a small conference room with a folding glass wall, and the latch had been out of true since the year the floor was built, and for 11 years, every person who used that room had learned to lift the door an inch with a knee and shove. The building's engineers had been told about it twice. Now the latch sat in the plate, and the door swung shut on its own weight. He stood there and worked it 4 times and looked down the corridor at the woman pushing a cart past 4419. And he didn't say anything to her about it. On the Thursday he came in at 11, and the photograph on the 3rd shelf had been taken out of its frame, and the glass cleaned properly on both sides for the first time in 23 years, and the frame put back square, and a folded square of paper towel wedged under the worn foot so it would hold. His mother was laughing at whoever had held the camera. He stood in front of that shelf with his coat still on for a considerable while. Then he hung the coat up and sat down and opened the folder that was waiting for him and didn't mention it, and it was never mentioned. She started speaking that week. It came in pieces so small he had to hold still to receive them. On the Monday, when he moved a chair out of the path of her cart, she said, "Thank you." Nothing else, and nothing for 3 days. On the Thursday, when he asked about her hand, she said, "It's healing." On the following Tuesday, he was reading a port lease at 1 in the morning, and he said he'd never known anybody who could work 11 hours standing. And she said, "You can," after a while. A week went by with nothing. Then, on a Sunday night, when the whole floor was black except his lamp, she stopped at the door on her way out and said, "Your mother had a good laugh," and she was gone before he'd finished turning his head. He never chased any of it. He never asked her a question that required more than 4 words back, and he never once returned to the things she'd said in that room 3 weeks earlier, though it sat in him every hour of every day. He had spent 23 years learning that pressure got him whatever he wanted from anybody, and he had proved it again on a telephone at midnight with a man he'd never have to see. He understood, without being able to say how he understood it, that pressure was the one thing in the world that would close her, and so he did the hardest thing he had ever done in his life, which was to sit in a room with the only answer he'd ever wanted, and wait. In the first week of June, she was called out to the North Shore house again. There was a dinner on the Saturday for men who did business with the family, and the agency was short, and Walter Hale asked for her by name, and she went. And it was nearly midnight before the last car left, and she was alone at the kitchen sink, with her sleeves pushed up, and a stack of serving platters. She heard the chair before she heard the man. Salvatore Vitale sat down at the kitchen table behind her, and set something on it, and folded his hands, and he waited until she'd turned around, and she stood with a dish towel in her hands, and water on her forearms, and said nothing. "I'm not going to raise my voice at you," he said. "You'll notice nobody in this family does that except my nephew, and only the one time." He turned a manila envelope over, and slid 3 things out of it, and laid them side by side on the table with the unhurried care of a man dealing cards. "Come look. It's your own business, so you may as well see it." She didn't move. He waited, and the waiting went on until it became simpler to walk over than to keep standing there, and she came to the near edge of the table and looked down. The first was a photocopy of a hospital statement. It was hers. It had the payment column running down the side in $100 increments, month after month, 30-some entries, and it had the balance at the bottom, and she recognized it as easily as she'd have recognized her own handwriting, because she had looked at that same sheet under a bare bulb on the 1st of every month for 3 years. The second was her rental agreement on 46th Street with a notice clipped to it, the kind of notice that gives a person 5 days, and it was dated 11 days earlier. The third was a photograph. It was a color photograph, a little faded on the left, the way old prints go, and it showed a woman in her early 30s, standing in a corridor in nurse's scrubs, with a plastic cup of coffee in one hand, and her hair pinned up wrong, caught unposed and half turned toward whoever had called her name. Eileen Keene had been dead 3 years. Audrey had 11 photographs of her mother in the world, and every one of them was in a shoebox, under a bed on 46th Street, and she had never in her life seen the one lying on that table. She stood absolutely still. She did not pick it up. She had learned 3 years ago that the surest way to hand a man something is to reach for what he's holding, So she kept her hands on the dish towel, and she looked at her mother's face on the table in a house 12 miles from anywhere her mother had ever been. "Here's the shape of it," Sal said. "That balance goes to 0 on Monday. Not forgiven, not restructured, paid. Then there's a sum on top, and I'd want you to hear the sum, because I've been generous, and it's the sort of thing a person regrets not listening to." He named it. It was more money than she had earned in the whole of her working life. "It goes to you in a cashier's check. You keep every dollar of it. All I ask is that you take a bus, or a train, or a plane if you like, and that when you get off it, you're not in the state of Illinois. Indiana's 40 minutes. Nobody's asking you to go far. Nobody's asking you to be punished." He let that sit. "That's the first road, and it's a good road, and I've offered it to you first because I'd genuinely rather you took it." Somewhere above them, a floorboard settled. "The other road is that you stay," Sal said. "And I want to be honest with you about what staying is, because I don't believe in surprising people. Nobody will lay a hand on you. Nobody will threaten you. I'm 66 years old, and I've never in my life had to do anything so crude." He put one finger on the corner of the photograph and turned it a half-inch, squaring it to the edge of the table. "It's only that a name is a fragile piece of property, Miss Keene, and yours is a good deal more fragile than most, because there's nobody left alive to stand up for it. And I've been at this a long time, and I've watched what a name can be made to do. I've watched them do it to better people than either of us." He stood up. He didn't gather the papers. "Think about it over the weekend. There's no hurry that I'd put on you." Then he went out through the far door, and the house took his footsteps up the back stairs, and there was nothing in the kitchen but the tap dripping once into the standing water. Audrey stood at the table for a long moment. Then she picked up all 3 sheets and the photograph together, squared them against her palm the way you square a deck, and carried them down the back hall to the small office behind the pantry where the household paper went. And she fed them into the shredder one at a time, and the photograph last, and she waited until the machine finished and went quiet. She came back to the kitchen. She put her hands in the water, which had gone cool, and she pulled the plug and ran it hot again. And she finished the platters, and she dried them, and she put every one of them away in the cupboard where they belonged. On the second Tuesday in June, 2 men came to the 38th floor at 9 in the morning, with a grand jury subpoena and a receipt for it. They were courteous. They didn't ask to see him and didn't want to, and they left with their receipt signed and their business done in under 4 minutes, and the paper they left behind reached Christian's desk at 20 past 9. It was a document request, and it was not narrow. 7 years of records on 4 terminal leases along the Calumet River. Every invoice, every subcontractor, every payment authorization, and the names of the officers who'd signed them. What made it serious wasn't the port. It was the statute cited at the bottom of the second page, because a document request under that statute isn't an inquiry into a lease. It's an inquiry into whether a company is a company at all, or whether it's a thing wearing a company's clothes. Christian read it twice, and then he had the lawyers in, and they were there until 7 at night. And what came out of it was simple enough that he could have arrived at it himself in the first hour. There were 2 businesses under one roof, and there always had been. One of them built things and paid taxes, and employed 1,100 people who woke up in the morning and put on boots. The other had made the first one possible 30 years ago, and had never been persuaded to leave. Any lawyer in the country could defend the first. Nobody could defend both. On the legal side, there were 1,100 names on a payroll, a chief financial officer, and an 18th floor full of people who filed things. On the other side, there were 4 men. One had the trades, locals, and the inspectors. One had the cash houses out past Cicero and Berwyn. One had the money that went out at 4 points a week to people who couldn't get it anywhere else. And one had the part that nobody put a name to, even in that room, even among themselves. All 4 of them had come up under his father. All 4 of them had reported to Christian for 17 years, and not one of them had put anything in writing in his life. In the neighborhood, the seat he sat in had a name, and nobody who used it ever used it in front of him. The arrangement was that Christian held the seat, and his uncle held the council. And in 17 years there had been perhaps 4 occasions when anybody needed reminding which was which. Sal came into the office the following evening. He didn't knock, and he never had, and he took the chair on the other side of the desk and looked at the paper lying on it for a while before he said anything at all. "I've seen 4 of these in my life," he said. 2 of them came to nothing. The other 2 took men I knew. "Did you read the statute?" "I don't need to read the statute. I know what it means." He sat back. It means somebody's talking. That's all it ever means. A prosecutor doesn't ask for 7 years of a river lease because he's curious about barges. Then the question is who? The question is not who, Sal said. The question is what this family looks like in the newspaper in September, and whether there's a photograph next to the story of you on the steps of a church with Harold Ashford's daughter on your arm, or whether there isn't. Christian didn't say anything. You think that's cynical? Sal said. It's the most practical thing anybody will say to you this year. Harold Ashford has given money to every man who's held the county board in 18 years. His brother-in-law sat on the state appellate bench. That's not protection from a federal prosecutor, and I'd never insult you by pretending it is, but it's a great deal of daylight, and daylight is what a man wants when they've started to look at him, because in the dark they can say anything about you and it plays. In the daylight they have to prove it. He put a hand flat on the arm of the chair. September the 11th. You stand up in that church, and you do the thing that was agreed 3 years ago, and by October you're a construction man with a wife whose family builds hospitals, and this paper on your desk becomes a lease dispute about a river. Christian turned the subpoena a quarter turn on the desk so that it faced away from him. Can I ask you something? He said. You've never had to ask. How much of my life have you arranged? Sal's face didn't move. But he was a man of 66 who had spent 40 of those years reading rooms for a living, and something behind his eyes went to work in the half-second before he answered, and Christian watched it happen. And that was the first time in 23 years that Christian had ever seen his uncle have to think about how to answer him. I raised you from 14, Sal said. There's no part of your life I haven't had my hands in. You've known that since you were 20. If you're asking me to apologize for it, I won't, because you're sitting in that chair and not in a garage on Grand Avenue, and the reason for that is me. That isn't what I asked. Then say what you're asking. I'm asking how much of it, Christian said, was arranged for me, and how much was arranged around me. The room went very quiet. Somewhere down the corridor the cleaning cart went by, and the wheels ticked over the seam in the floor, and both men heard it, and neither of them looked at the door. You've never asked me a question like that in your life, Sal said. No. Who's put it in your head? Nobody's put anything in my head. Sal stood up. He took his time about it, and he buttoned his jacket, and when he spoke again, his voice was perfectly even, and there was something underneath the evenness that hadn't been in the room before. September the 11th, he said. I'd want you to be very careful about what you take up in the meantime, Christian. There are people who've waited a long time for this family to become distracted. Don't be the one who obliges them. He went out and left the door open behind him. Christian sat and looked at the paper on his desk for a long while. Then he reached over and closed the door himself. Then he picked up the telephone. The document request had named the officers who'd signed the payment authorizations, and there were 3 of them, and one was a foreman who had signed a great many things over 7 years, without reading most of them, and who talked when he drank. By Thursday, that man had been offered a supervisor's post on a project outside Phoenix, at a salary he'd have had to work 11 more years in Chicago to see, with a start date of Monday and the ticket paid. By Friday, 2 boxes of authorizations from the earliest year had stopped existing, and nobody in that building could have said who carried them out, because nobody had been asked to, and nobody had been told. It took him under an hour. He was 37 years old, and he'd done it a dozen times before, and he didn't think of it as a crime while he was doing it, and it was one, and if a jury had ever been told the whole of it plainly, they'd have needed about 20 minutes. The Ashfords came out to the North Shore house for dinner on the 3rd Saturday in June, and the agency was short again, and Audrey worked the floor. Walter noticed the case at 10 minutes to 9. It stood in the front room against the inside wall, a shallow glass-fronted case with 4 shelves, and on the second shelf there had been a woman's wristwatch on a folded square of velvet for 23 years, and now there was the velvet and the shape pressed into it, and nothing else. He said nothing to the guests. He went and found Marcus Doyle in the hall, and told him quietly, and Marcus went to the case and looked, and then he went and stood at the end of the corridor, and had somebody bring him the camera log from the gate, and he did not go to Christian until the dessert had been cleared. By 10 o'clock the guests understood that something was wrong, in the way a room always understands. It was Vivienne who said it out loud. She said it lightly, and she said it to Sal rather than to Christian, and she said it in a voice that carried about as far as it needed to, that it was a dreadful thing to have to say, and that she'd hate to be unfair to anybody, but that when a house has agency people in it who nobody's ever met, The kind thing for everyone concerned was to look and be done and clear the whole matter up. Harold Ashford said that seemed reasonable. Marcus took 2 men and went down the back hall. There were 4 coats hanging on the pegs outside the staff room. He worked from the left. The third one was a woman's gray wool coat, and he put his hand in the outside pocket, and the watch was in it. He stood there a moment with his hand still in the pocket. Then he took it out, and he held it flat on his palm, and he walked back up the corridor with it. The dinner ended. Nobody was told anything, and everybody knew. Cars came forward, and Harold Ashford shook Christian's hand at the door, with the particular sympathy of a man who has just watched something useful happen. And Vivian kissed the air beside his cheek and said she was so sorry the evening had been spoiled. Then it was the family. They put her in the front room. Audrey stood with her back to the glass case and her hands at her sides, and Christian stood at the fireplace. And Sal sat down in the chair by the window and crossed one leg over the other. Marcus set the watch on the folded velvet, back where it had always been, and stepped away. "It was in her coat," Sal said. "Marcus, was it in her coat?" "Yes. In the pocket, or under something, or sewn into something. The outside pocket, right-hand side. Thank you." Sal looked at Christian. "Now I want to say a thing, and I want to say it once, and then I'll be quiet, and you can do whatever you're going to do." He put his fingers together. 9 days ago, 2 men walked into your building with a federal subpoena. 7 years of records. Somebody is talking to a prosecutor. Christian. And prosecutors don't build cases out of paper alone. They build them out of paper and a person, and the person has to be somewhere. She has to be inside. He nodded slightly toward the woman by the case. 8 months ago, a woman with no family, no telephone, no bank, no friends, and no history worth the name, takes a job on your floors. Nobody's that invisible by accident. Your own man told you so, and he was right, and you've been carrying his file around in your head ever since without asking yourself the plain question. Say the plain question. Who made her invisible? Sal said. Because she didn't do it for the fun of it. And then in April she stands up in a room full of 70 people and does the one thing on this earth that would put her in front of you and keep her there. And she's been in front of you every night since. And now the only object in this house that means anything to you at all is in her coat pocket. He opened his hands. I don't say she's a thief. A thief takes a watch out of the house. She took it 11 feet and put it in a coat, where anybody looking would find it. Because a thief wants a watch, and she wanted the search. She wanted to be caught with it. And when you sit down tomorrow and try to work out why in God's name a person would want that, you'll get one answer. And it's that when this ends and you're gone, somebody has to be able to say she was never on your side. Christian looked at Audrey the whole time Sal was speaking. She stood with her back to the case, and she did not look at the floor, and she did not look at Sal. She looked at him. Her face was exactly as still as it had been on the night of his birthday, with glass shut in her hand. Is there anything you want to say? Christian said. Nothing. Anything at all. The room waited. Audrey Keene did not open her mouth. She did not deny it. She did not explain where she'd been at 8 o'clock or 9. She did not ask who had put it there or say that she hadn't, and she did not say the 4 words that would have cost her nothing on earth. She stood in the middle of that room and let herself be looked at, and gave them nothing. And Christian felt the old floor of his life tilt very slowly under him. It was Sal who said the word police, and he said it the way a man reaches for the least of the available evils. In 20 years, no police officer had been called to anything belonging to that family. Not for a break-in, not for a car, not once, not ever. Every man standing in that room had grown up understanding that it simply wasn't done. And that was the reason the word landed in the room the way it did. If the family handled it privately, then the family had handled it. And if a prosecutor ever wanted to make something of the fact that a woman had been found in that house with that watch, and had simply gone away afterward, he would be able to make a great deal of it. Do it on paper. Do it in daylight. Call the township, and let the township write it down. Christian stood at the fireplace with his hand on the mantel, and did not answer for some while. And afterward, for the rest of his life, he would not be able to give an honest account of what went through him in those minutes. He would say verification. He would say he needed to know, and that there was no way to know while she stood in his front room refusing to speak. That was the sentence he used later. And it was true, and it was not the whole truth, and he knew the difference even at the time. The whole truth was that a thing had been building in him for 2 months that he had no vocabulary for, and it frightened him more than any subpoena, and Sal had just handed him a way to put it down. So he said, "Do it." And he did not look at her when he said it. 2 officers came at 11:15. They were young and careful, and everything they did was routine, because to them, it was routine. They asked her name and she gave it, and it was the last thing she said all night. They asked whether she'd like to explain how the item came to be in her coat, and she stood with her hands at her sides and looked past them at the empty velvet in the case. One of them took the coat as property. It was June, and she went out into the driveway in her sleeves. Christian was in the doorway of the front room. She passed within 4 feet of him, the same 4 feet she had passed on the night of his birthday with the dustpan in her hands. And she looked at him, and there was nothing in her face he could use. No accusation, no plea. She was not asking him for anything, and she was not forgiving him for anything. And she went out down the steps and got into the back of the car by herself without being guided, and the door shut, and he watched the taillights go along the hedge and out through the gate. She was taken to a district station on the northwest side. She was booked at 10 minutes to 1 in the morning. There was a bench, and a room with a door, and a female officer who was kind to her in a distracted way. Someone put a paper cup of water in front of her at some point, and she drank it. Sometime after 2, an investigator came in and sat down across the table, and turned a chair sideways so as not to be square to her, which was a thing he'd learned in 19 years, and which usually worked. He put a folder on the table and didn't open it. He told her he wasn't in a hurry. He told her that in his experience there were about 4 ways a watch got into a coat, and only one of them was theft, and that the other 3 all had one thing in common, which was that the person in the chair had to say something because nobody in the world could say it for her. He asked whether anyone had asked her to do it. He asked whether anyone had threatened her, or her family, or her work, and whether she was afraid of anybody in that house, and he told her that if she was sitting in the one room in the county where that could be written down. He said, at one point, quite gently, that he had a daughter about her age. Audrey Keene sat with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the edge of the table, and she did not say one word. Not one. She was not being stubborn. She had thought it through in the back of the car with the hedge going by, and it came out the same way every time she thought it through, which was that the truth she had would require her to say a great deal more than 4 words. It would require her to say what she was doing in that house at all, and where she had learned a song, and who had taught it to her, and what she had done on the last night of her mother's life. And she had held that door shut for 3 years with her whole body, and she did not have the strength left to open it under a strip light in front of a stranger, who had a folder and a daughter and a job to do. And there was the other thing, the thing underneath, which was that a man she had squared a photograph for had stood in a doorway and said, "Do it," and had not looked at her, and something in her had simply gone quiet at that. So she gave the room the only thing she had left to give it, which was nothing. The investigator waited a long while. Then he closed the folder and said he'd be back in the morning, and he went out, and she spent the rest of that night on a bench in a holding cell with the lights on and the sound of the building going on around her, and she did not cry, and she did not sleep. 12 miles north. Walter Hale did not go to bed. He came down at 1:30 when the house had emptied, and he stood in front of the glass case in the front room. The watch was back on its velvet. Everything in that room was exactly as it had been at 8 o'clock the previous evening, and he stood in front of it in the dark with his hands at his sides, an old man in a house he had served for 40 years, and something that had been buried for 23 of them began, very slowly, to come up through him. He was still standing there when the sky went gray over the lake. Marcus Doyle came into the study at 10 minutes past 6 with a laptop under his arm, and he didn't sit down, and he didn't preface it. "There's a camera on the back hall," he said. "It covers the pantry door. It doesn't cover the coat pegs, so I spent the night working out what it does cover, which is anybody who walks past them." He set the laptop on the desk and turned it. "This is 8:14. The picture was gray, and the corridor was empty for a moment, and then a woman crossed it from left to right and was gone in under 2 seconds. She wasn't hurrying. She had a folded napkin in her hand the way a person does when they're on an errand nobody's going to ask about. Christian knew her face. He had seen it at 3 dinners and 2 fundraisers, standing a careful yard behind Vivian Ashford's shoulder, holding a phone, saying nothing. "That's her assistant," Marcus said. "She was in that hall at 8:14. The service staff were all in the kitchen at 8:14 because I've got the kitchen camera and I've got all 4 of them in frame. Audrey Keene was on the floor of the dining room with a tray until 8:40. She was never within 30 feet of those coats." He touched the trackpad. "There's one more thing, and it's not on this laptop, so you'll have to take it from me. At 6:20 last evening, that woman took a call in the turnaround by the garages. 2 of my men were in the garage doing nothing in particular, and they both heard the same 3 words at the end of it, which were, 'Yes, Mr. Vitale.'" He straightened up. "Your uncle was in Elmwood Park at 6:20. I checked." Christian sat perfectly still. There is a particular kind of quiet that comes over a man when the thing he has been refusing to look at for a week turns around and looks at him. And it is not rage, because rage is loud, and it is not grief, because grief has somewhere to go. It is the sound of an accounting being made in a room with the door shut. He had stood in a doorway 9 hours earlier and said, "Do it." He had said it in the presence of the one man in the world who had needed him to say it. He had not been deceived. Exactly. He had been handed a reason, and he had taken it, because the reason let him put down something he was afraid to carry. That was the truth of it. And no camera in that house was going to change 1 inch of it. He picked up the telephone. It took him 20 minutes with a lawyer on the line, and 40 more on the telephone with the township. And it was not complicated, because nothing in this world moves faster than a complainant who no longer wishes to complain. The property had never left the house. The complainant declined to pursue. The papers hadn't gone downtown yet, and by 8:30 they weren't going to. He didn't send Marcus. He drove himself, which he had not done in 11 years, and he sat in the front seat of the car in the parking lot of a district station on the northwest side at 9:15 in the morning, until a door opened, and a woman came out into the daylight in her sleeves with a gray wool coat, folded over her arm because it was June and somebody had given it back to her at the desk. She stopped at the top of the steps. She looked at the car for a moment, and then she came down the steps and got into the front seat beside him, and shut the door, and put the coat on her lap. He didn't start the engine. He sat with both hands on the wheel, and looked out through the windshield at the chain-link fence in front of them. "I was wrong," he said. She said nothing. "There's a recording of the haul. It wasn't you, and I knew it wasn't you before there was a recording, and I let 2 men take you out of my house anyway, because a man told me a story that let me stop being afraid of you, and I took it." He turned the key. "I'm not going to say that a second time to anybody." That was all he said, and it was not an apology. And he was 37 years old, and had never in his life made one, and the sentence he'd built instead was the closest thing to one that existed inside him. He put the car in gear, and they drove north, and neither of them spoke for 20 minutes. She sat with the coat in her lap and her face turned to the window, and she watched the morning go past, and inside her a thing was happening that she would not have been able to explain to anybody, least of all to him. She had spent 3 years arranging her whole life around one principle, which was that if she never gave anybody anything, then nobody could ever take anything from her again. It had worked. It had worked perfectly. It had cost her a night on a bench in a cell where a kind man with a folder had asked her 4 times whether she was afraid of anyone. And she had sat there and let him believe she might be a thief, because opening the door was worse. And a man who had every reason in the world to say nothing had just sat in a parking lot and said I was wrong. Out loud, first, with no camera on him and nobody watching, and nothing at all to gain by it. She looked out the window at the traffic, and the low sun coming off the glass of it. And somewhere north of Fullerton, without saying a word, she decided. She slept most of that day in the room at the back of the house on the ground floor, and in the evening she got up and ate what Walter put in front of her, and at 2:00 in the morning she came out into the kitchen and found Christian sitting at the table with a cup of coffee he hadn't touched. He didn't ask her why she was up. She sat down across from him, which she had never done, and she put her hands flat on the table, and she looked at them for a while, and then she began. "I had a scholarship," she said. "Voice, Roosevelt, downtown on Michigan Avenue. I started at 18 and I was good. Not the best one in the room. 3rd or 4th in that room, and that room was very good." She turned her hands over. "I left in the middle of my 3rd year. I was 21. My mother had gone yellow in the eyes in a photograph at Christmas, and by February they'd found it in her pancreas. And by the middle of March I'd withdrawn from the program and I never went back." She said it without any weight on it, the way a person reads a date off a document. Her name was Eileen Keene. She was a hospice nurse for 29 years. Not a hospital nurse, hospice. She sat with people in the last 3 or 4 days of it, mostly at night, because that's when they go and that's when the families can't do it anymore. 29 years of walking into rooms where the worst thing that would ever happen to that family was happening, and sitting down in the chair and staying. She used to say the only skill in the whole job was being willing to be in the room. Christian didn't move. She sang me that song. Audrey said. From when I was 4. Every night. I didn't know what the words meant, and I still don't know what most of them mean. And I asked her twice in my whole life where it came from, and both times she said the same thing and never one word more. She stopped. She said, "This one belongs to a boy who never got to hear the end of it." She let that sit on the table. I thought it was a story. I thought it was a thing you say to a child who's asking questions at bedtime. I was 4. And then I was 9. And then I was 20. And by then, it was just something my mother did. And I never asked her a third time. Her voice had not changed at all. I took care of her for 3 years. She was on the couch in the front room, and then she was in a bed we put in the front room. And I worked nights and did it in the days. And toward the end, nobody was coming anymore because that's what happens. People come for the first 6 months. It was me, 3 years of it. And by the last month, I hadn't slept more than 4 hours together in longer than I could remember. And I want to be honest with you about what I was by then. I wasn't good. I was so tired, I hated her. I hated her in the mornings when I had to change the bed, and I hated her at 3 in the afternoon, and I hated myself the rest of the time. And both of those things were going on inside the same person who would have died for her. She stopped and breathed once. The last night she asked me to sing. Christian sat absolutely still. She could hardly get sound out by then. She had to say it twice for me to understand her. And what she said was, "Sing it for me, Audrey. That's all. Sing it for me." And I was standing at the end of the bed with a basin in my hands at midnight, and I had been on my feet for 19 hours, and something in me came up out of a place I didn't know I had. Her hands hadn't moved on the table. I screamed at her. I told her I was done. I told her I wasn't going to sing, that I was never going to sing again, that she'd taken everything I had, and now she wanted the last thing. And I asked her what she thought was left. She stopped. That's what I said to my mother. Those are the words. I've had 3 years to make them into something else, and they won't go. The kitchen was completely quiet. She died at 4:20 in the morning. I was in the chair. I hadn't said anything else to her in between. She looked up at him then for the first time since she'd sat down. "I'm not mute," she said. "There's nothing wrong with my throat. I could have spoken to that investigator last night, and I could have spoken to you in your front room, and I could have spoken to you 8 months ago." Her voice went down. Not softer, only lower. I stopped because I decided I didn't have the right to use it anymore. That's all it ever was. A woman asked me for 4 minutes of the only thing I had that was any good, on the last night of her life, and I told her no. And I have not been able to work out, in 3 years, what a person does with that. She stopped. One tear went down the side of her face, and she didn't touch it, and she didn't make a sound, and she didn't produce another one. Christian did not reach across the table. He did not tell her it wasn't her fault, because it was, in part, and she would have known he was lying, and she'd already had enough of that from the world. He sat with it for a long moment. Then he said, "You sing better than any of it deserved to make you." She looked at him. "That's a strange thing to say." "It's what I meant." She went back to 46th Street that afternoon, and she came out with a shoebox under her arm, and in the evening she put a notebook on the kitchen table in front of him. It was a hospice nurse's field book, with a blue paper cover gone soft at the corners, the kind a woman buys at a drugstore for $1 and carries in a bag for 11 months. She kept one for every year, Audrey said. "There were 29 of them, and I kept 4, and this is the oldest one I've got." Christian opened it. It was working paper, medication times, room numbers, a family's telephone number, a note to buy bread, the shorthand of a woman's hands moving fast in a corridor at 2 in the morning, and then near the back, on a right-hand page, in a slower and more careful hand than any of the rest of it, 4 lines of words, in a language he had heard exactly once in 23 years, and had heard every night of his life before that. 2 of the words had been crossed out and written again. There was a note in the margin about a syllable being long, and underneath the 4 lines, small, the way a nurse initials a chart, were 2 letters, S.V. He sat with his hand flat on the page for a long time. "The last night," Audrey said. "She asked me to sing it. I've told you what I did. What I haven't told you is that I never once, in 23 years, asked her whose it was, and she never told me, and I've had this book in a shoebox for 3 years and never opened it past the middle." Christian stood up. He carried the notebook down the hall and found Walter Hale in the pantry, counting linen at 9 o'clock at night, which was the sort of thing Walter did when he intended not to be spoken to, and he put the book open in his hands and said nothing at all. Walter looked at the page. He read the 4 lines, which he could not have understood, and then he read the 2 letters at the bottom, which he could. His hand went out sideways and found the edge of the shelf. Then he closed the book and held it a moment, and then he walked out of the pantry and into the kitchen and pulled a chair out from the table and sat down in it, in front of Christian Vitali, for the first time in 40 years. "Sit down," he said. "I've been standing since I was 31, and it hasn't done either of us any good." Christian sat. Audrey was still at the far end of the table. "Nobody asked her to leave. Your mother didn't die in this house," Walter said. "You've always known that. What you were told was that she went into a place out past Wheeling where they could keep her comfortable, and that it was a mercy, and that a boy of 14 has no business in a room like that." He put his hand flat on the blue cover. "The part that was never said to you is who decided who walked through that door. Your uncle held the list. He held it from the first week. He told me it was mercy, and I believe to this day that he half meant it. You went out there twice. Once in the last week you were driven out and turned around in the drive, and you were told she was sleeping. She wasn't sleeping. There were 3 nights at the end, and there was not one member of this family in that room for any of them." Christian's face had gone perfectly still. "So there was a nurse," Walter said. "Nights. She sat with your mother for 3 nights, and your mother could still talk for the first 2 of them. And I have thought a great deal over the years about what a woman says in a room like that, when the only person listening is a stranger who's willing to be in the room." He turned the notebook a quarter turn on the table, the way a man straightens a thing he cannot fix. "She came to the gate here 3 times. First on the Tuesday after the funeral. She had an envelope in her hand, and she said she had a message from Mrs. Vitali for her son, and she asked to be allowed to give it to you herself." He stopped. "I sent her away. She came back on the Friday. I sent her away again. She came the 3rd time in September, in the rain, and she stood at that gate for the better part of 20 minutes. His voice didn't rise and it didn't break. I was following an instruction. I thought it was the kindest thing on God's earth for a boy who'd been asked to carry 2 funerals in 2 years. I have thought that every day since, and I have been wrong for 23 of them. Nobody said anything. Christian did not stand up and he did not raise his voice. And if he had wanted to say something, he would have found there was nothing in him that could be put into a sentence. Then Walter turned in the chair and looked down the table at Audrey. "There's one other thing," he said, "and then I'm finished. I saw your name on your badge in this kitchen in April. Keen. I don't forget names. It's the one skill the work ever gave me." He looked at his own hands. "You had a hospital balance in your mother's name. It was settled the week before last. It's paid." Audrey didn't move. "There's no more to say about it," Walter said. "Don't ask me to. I'm 71 years old and I had it, and there was nothing else it was ever going to be for. It was Audrey who found it." She went back through the blue notebook page by page that night, while the other 2 sat with the coffee going cold, and 11 pages before the 4 lines there was an entry that wasn't medication times or a room number, and it was written in the same slow, careful hand, and at the top of it Eileen Keene had put the date and a single word, which was message. Christian read it twice, sitting down and once standing up. His mother had dictated it in the small hours of the 2nd night, and a nurse who had never met her before that week had taken it down in the shorthand of her trade and then written it out again in full, because she'd understood that shorthand wouldn't survive her. "Don't stay. You don't owe this family anything. There's money that's mine and not theirs, and it's yours, and I want you to take it and get out of Chicago and do something you don't have to hide. If they tell you I died wanting you to be strong for the family, they're lying to you." And underneath that, 4 more lines in the old dialect, and a note beside them in English in the nurse's hand that said, "She says this is the end of it. She never finished it before, and she wants him to have the whole song." Christian stood in his own kitchen at 1 o'clock in the morning holding a dollar drugstore notebook, and he read the 4 lines, and he could not sing them, because he had never once heard them, and there was no one left alive on the earth who could put a tune under them. No one alive but one, and she was asleep in a room at the back of his house, and he didn't ask her, and she didn't offer. He did not read them aloud. He closed the book. He drove out to Elmwood Park the next evening, and Sal poured him coffee he didn't drink, and they sat in the front room with the screen open and the sound of the neighborhood coming in, and Christian put the notebook on the low table between them and turned it to the page. "Read it," he said. Sal read it. It took him a while, because he was 66, and because he read carefully, and because he had known for 23 years what would be on such a page, if such a page ever surfaced. Then he closed it and set it down and sat back in his chair. He didn't deny it. He didn't reach for a version of it. "There was a woman who came to that gate," he said. 3 times. Walter told me each time, and I told him each time what to do. You knew what was in it. I knew the shape of what was in it." He put his hands together. "Christian, I want you to understand the room I was standing in that autumn. Your father was 2 years dead. You were 14 years old and the only Vitale left with the name. And there were 4 men in this city that year who were counting the weeks until this family had nobody at the head of the table. If you had gone off to some school in Arizona with your mother's money, everything my brother built and everything your grandfather built would have been taken apart inside of 18 months, and there'd have been nothing left for you to come back to. There'd have been nothing left of us at all. That isn't a reason. It's an inventory. It's both, and you're old enough to know most reasons are. You kept her last words from her son. I kept a piece of paper," Sal said. "That's the whole of what I did, and I've never told myself otherwise. I didn't put a hand on anybody. I didn't hurt that nurse, and I never had her looked into, and I never had her spoken to. I kept a piece of paper out of a boy's hands for 1 year, and then 2, and after 5 the thing was done, and there was no way to undo it that wouldn't have cost you more than it gave you." He looked steadily at his nephew. "And you sat at the head of the table. You've sat there for 17 years, and you've been better at it than your father, and I'd do the same thing again tomorrow." Christian took the notebook back and put it inside his coat. "You didn't just keep a piece of paper," he said. "You kept the whole thing, every year of it." He was on the expressway going east when the telephone rang, and it was Marcus. And Marcus had spent 9 days on something he hadn't been asked to look at. There were 2 meetings in April, one in March, in a restaurant in Cicero. And a man who had been at all 3 was a man from a family on the west side who had wanted a piece of the Calumet terminals for 11 years. There was a draft agreement, or the pieces of one, in the hands of a lawyer who had once worked for the Vitale Group and now did not. And in the last of the 3 sheets Marcus had gotten hold of, in a numbered list of conditions, there was a line about the Ashford marriage, September the 11th, and it was not a courtesy, and it was not a note. It was a term. Somebody on the other side of that table had required it, and somebody on this side had agreed to it, and it had been agreed in March, and nobody had mentioned it to the man who was supposed to stand up in the church. Christian pulled the car onto the shoulder somewhere past Harlem Avenue and sat there with the engine running and the traffic going by him at 70 miles an hour, and he understood, all at once and completely, that he had never in his life chosen a single thing. Not the chair, not the work, not the woman he was to marry in 11 weeks, not even the grief, which had been arranged for him too, at 14, by a man with a list and a gate, and a very good reason. The memorial mass was said at St. Cecilia Church on Taylor Street on the last Saturday in June, as it had been said on the last Saturday in June for 23 years, and afterward there was coffee and food in the parish hall the way there always was, and better than 100 people came down for it. Cousins, 2 men from the old neighborhood who had known Vincent, wives and the wives of sons, 6 men who did business with the family and came to this one mass every year the way you pay a small annual tax. Christian stood near the doors with a cup he didn't drink from. Audrey had come because Walter Hale had said, in the front hall that morning, that she ought to, and neither of them had explained it any further than that, and she stood along the side wall with a glass of water and spoke to nobody, and nobody spoke to her. Sal was at the far end near the coffee urns with 4 or 5 men around him, and after a while he put his cup down on the table and began to talk in the particular voice he used when he intended a thing to travel. It was not loud. It was pitched at the 2 men in front of him and aimed at the 40 behind them. He said it was a hard year. He said a family gets tested, and this one had been tested twice in 2 months, first by men with subpoenas and then in its own house, and he was sorry to have to speak of it in this hall of all places, on this day of all days. He said there'd been a theft. He said there was a woman who had come into that house through an agency and had put her hand on the one object left in the world that had belonged to the woman they'd all just prayed for, and that he wasn't going to say more than that in front of the ladies, except that he'd had occasion to look into where this woman had come from. And if a person knew her history the way he'd come to know it, they would understand that nobody ought to be surprised, and that as for the rest of it, there was a good deal he could put on this table right now that would put a very different complexion on the whole matter of that night in April. He said, "If I told you what I know about that woman." Audrey set her glass down on the folding table beside her. She walked the length of that hall. She didn't hurry, and her heels made a sound on the linoleum, and the room felt her coming before it understood what it was feeling, and by the time she was halfway down it, the talking had come apart in patches, and then stopped altogether. She stopped beside Salvatore Vitale, close enough that he had to turn his head to see her. He stopped in the middle of the sentence, because there wasn't anything else available to him. "I'd rather tell it myself," she said. She wasn't looking at the room. She was looking at him. Then she turned and spoke to the room, in a flat voice with no lift in it anywhere, and the room heard every word. "My mother's name was Eileen Keene," she said. "She was a hospice nurse in this city for 29 years. In June of the year Serafina Vitale died. My mother sat with her for 3 nights in a place out past Wheeling. Nights, because that's when people go. And she worked nights her whole life. 3 nights, and she was the only person in the room. Not because this family didn't want to be there. Because her son was 14 years old, and somebody had decided who was allowed through the door, and he was driven out there, and turned around in the drive, and told his mother was sleeping. Nobody in that hall made a sound. My mother sat in a chair and listened to a woman she'd never met, and she learned a song from her that had never been written down anywhere on this earth, and she learned it so it wouldn't die in that room with the person who made it. She wrote down 4 lines that had never been finished. Then she went home. She let the next part come out at exactly the same weight as the rest of it, and then she came to the gate of that house on the North Shore 3 times, once on the Tuesday after the funeral, with an envelope in her hand, asking to give a dying woman's last words to her own son, once again on the Friday, and a 3rd time in September, in the rain, and she stood at that gate for the better part of 20 minutes. At the 3rd table from the front, Walter Hale stood up out of his chair. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He was 71 years old, and every person in that hall had known him for 30 years or more. And he stood there facing the front of the room with his hands at his sides, and the meaning of it went through that hall like cold water. Audrey didn't look at him. She looked at the room. "Now the part about me," she said, since it was offered. "I clean offices at night. 2 buildings, 6 nights a week. I am not mute. I stopped speaking for 3 years because on the last night of my mother's life, she asked me to sing to her, and I told her no. The room was perfectly still. That's the whole of it. There's nothing left in it for anybody to use." Christian crossed the hall then, and not before, and he came and stood 3 feet from his uncle. "That's enough, Sal," he said quietly. Then he took the blue notebook out of his coat and opened it and set it down on the table among the cups, facing the room, at the page with 4 lines, and 2 crossed-out words, and a nurse's 2 initials at the bottom. Nobody in the hall came forward to look at it. Nobody needed to. Sal stood there a moment doing the arithmetic of a man who has spent 40 years knowing exactly when a position has stopped being defensible. Then he picked his hat up off the table, and he went out through the side door into the alley, and the door swung shut behind him on its own weight. The lawyers took 11 days over it. What Christian gave the United States Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Illinois was not testimony about anybody's life, and it was not a story about a family. It was paper. 7 years of it, and then the other paper. The March and April meetings in Cicero, the draft with the numbered conditions in it, the lawyer in Rosemont who had once worked for the Vitale Group and now did not. In exchange, the construction company stayed a construction company, with 1,100 people, and their boots, and their insurance, and their Fridays, and the rest of it. The part that had made the first part possible 30 years ago and had never agreed to leave, was handed over in a banker's box and did not come back. In the world he'd been raised in, there was exactly one thing a man in that seat could not do, and he did it, and he was aware of it the whole time. What he had to hold on to was thin, and he knew how thin it was. It was that his uncle had sat down in a restaurant in Cicero in March, with men from the West Side, and had put this family on a table without telling him, and that whatever faith there had been was broken in that room in March, and not in a federal building in August. He told the 4 men himself. In one room, on one afternoon, 2 of them shook his hand. 2 of them didn't, and he never saw either of those 2 again. A federal grand jury returned an indictment against Salvatore Vitale in the 3rd week of August. He was 66 years old, and he was released the same afternoon on conditions, and he went home to Elmwood Park, and whatever was left of his life was going to happen in a courtroom on Dearborn Street, with a docket number over it, and no one to arrange the outcome for him. Christian did not go and see him. He wrote to him twice, and neither letter said anything about the notebook, and he was never able afterward to explain to himself why he wrote them. The engagement was ended in the first week of July, and it was ended publicly, and Harold Ashford withdrew from every joint interest inside of a month, which was the only thing about that whole summer that surprised nobody. Vivienne came out to the house once to collect 2 boxes. She was at the front door with a driver behind her when she stopped, because Audrey was in the hall with a stack of folded linen in her arms, on her way through, going nowhere important. They looked at each other for a moment. Vivienne Ashford had 100 sentences for a moment like that, and had spent 11 years building them, and she opened her mouth and found that not one of them would come out. Then she turned and went down the steps to the car. Walter Hale gave notice on a Tuesday in July, formally, in writing, on a folded sheet of paper he had clearly spent some evenings on. Christian read it standing up and put it in his pocket. "You'll stay," he said. "You still owe me 40 years. That was all either of them ever said about it. What it cost him wasn't money. Nobody from Taylor Street came out to that house again. The men who had shaken his hand stopped calling, and then stopped answering. And by the autumn there wasn't a living person who had known his father who would sit down at a table with him. He'd been raised for one world since he was 14 years old, and by October he had no standing in it at all. There were nights that winter when he sat in the kitchen at 2 in the morning and understood precisely what he had traded, and did not want it back. There was money of his mother's that had sat in an account since he was 14, and that he'd never touched. In November he signed the whole of it over to a hospice on the South Side, without a letter, without his name on anything, and he never mentioned it to anybody in that house. 6 months went by. In January, on a Saturday morning with the light coming flat and white off the snow, Audrey Keene was in her second week back at Roosevelt on Michigan Avenue, finishing the year she'd left at 21, and she had gone and got the scholarship reinstated by herself through the office and the paperwork and a jury audition in front of 4 people who didn't know her name, and she had not asked him for $1, and he had not offered one. 3 afternoons a week she taught a beginner's voice class at a community center on the South Side. 11 women and 2 men, most of them past 60, in a room with a piano that wouldn't hold its tuning, 4 blocks from a hospice where her mother had worked nights for 29 years. That morning she came down to the kitchen early and made coffee, and put the blue notebook on the table, open, at the page with the 4 lines in her mother's careful hand, and the 2 crossed-out words and the note in the margin about the long syllable. Then she went to the stove. Christian came down at 7. He stood at the table and looked at the open book for a while. He looked at her. He didn't say anything at all. He pulled out a chair and sat down, and she turned around and sang him the 4 lines, the end of it, the part his mother never finished and never got to give him, set to the tune she herself had been sung to sleep with since she was 4 years old, because there was nobody left on this earth who could have carried the one across to the other. He put his hand flat on the table. She put hers over it. The notebook stayed on that table after that, and neither of them ever moved it. There are 3 things worth carrying out of this story. The first is that the invisible people are people. A woman pushed a cart through a building for 8 months, and nobody learned her name. And the cost of that habit, in the end, was 23 years of somebody else's life. The second is that a kindness that gets turned away at a gate is not a kindness that dies. Eileen Keene failed 3 times, and she wrote it down anyway. And it arrived 23 years late, and it still arrived. And the third is that silence is not the same as having nothing to say, and that forgiving yourself is harder work than forgiving anybody else, and slower, and it is worth doing. If this story moved you, please subscribe to the channel, and leave a like, and share it with somebody who needs it today, so more stories like this one can find their way to you. We would truly love to hear from you in the comments. Was there ever a person in your own life whose name you never learned, or a word you wish you had said while there was still time to say it? Tell us. We read every one of them, and we listen with our whole hearts. Thank you for staying to the end with us. We wish you good health, a peaceful heart, and quiet joy in your days. Goodbye for now, and we will see you in the next video.